My name is Marzia D'Amico. I'm a doctor of philosophy in medieval and modern languages. I got my PhD in Oxford and then recently, well, about 4 years ago, moved to Lisbon, where I'm currently an FCT junior researcher in the field of Italian studies and comparative literature, focusing specifically on gender studies and resourceful skills that we can apply to investigating the counter-canon, particularly when from feminist perspective. I specifically investigate the counter-canon, as mentioned. So everything that happened, experimentally speaking, in poetry in Italy, starting from the 1968, let's say, and moreover developing towards the 70s and 80s, I then decided to specifically focus on the results of not just female-produced operas, but mainly on the experimental techniques adopted by women and the people who identified as women as a structural lens of investigation, because it is my concern not to risk to create a sort of what has been called a pink ghetto of production made by women, but rather investigate the phenomenon of feminism as an engine in production for these women. I believe that nowadays using a feminist lens is part of a decolonial process of redistribute attention towards those who has been radically marginalized towards the creation of what we tend to consider the Western canon. And I can only speak with consciousness about the Western canon because it's what I am more immersed into as a person myself, but also because it's what I've been studying throughout the years. Yet I believe that this can easily be adopted as an approach towards many other fields and areas of study and discussion. A feminist lens is nowadays fundamental because it's never reductive. A feminist lens, it's what really helps us subverting the imbalance of what we've been submerged from the kind of information we received since a very young age, both scholarly and not scholarly speaking. So for me, it's just one of the many lenses of the decolonial project that we have towards creating a more fair world. And we can actually do that through literature, in my opinion. So for poetry in particular, I want to always quote the very important sentence from the essay of Audre Lorde, in which she says, poetry is not a luxury for women. And that is fundamental, because it's something that we should never relegate to the margins of our education. Poetry and the arts forms our soul and our reception of the world in so many ways. And we can restore, well, rather than restore, we can create a different system of values through the education of it. The two things somewhat came together at some stage of my life. I was writing poetry in Italian when I was very young, and I sort of regret it in many ways because it was not my best effort. When I moved to the UK, I somewhat had access to a vocabulary that was more pertinent to what was interesting to me. And I think that also creating a detachment between myself and my native language helped me develop the necessary detachment to put a filter in what is a creation meant to be public. And by public, I mean political, in a very Hannah Arendt way of understanding that every action that we make, that we do in the world, is always in correlation and relation with the others, with a capital O, with the alterity, let's say. So for me, like going back to poetry was sort of like going first time to poetry through the English language. And I have now returned to writing in my first language, where I have had problems somewhat in expressing myself freely. And my latest project that was recently published by Zona Editore, Ragazze Laser, has in its own title a grammatical problem of rendering the experience of a non-binary person grammatically in the structure of our language, which is something that I never encountered when I first came out as a non-binary woman in English language. And for me to recreate this whole understanding of the world that is that I inherited from fighting with my sisters as a person who tries to be maybe not an activist, but as active and outspoken as possible when it comes to the injustices of the world has been fundamental, because I believe that nowadays poetry has the same responsibility it has always had, which is to respond to the requests of the world and to make fair the injustices, to point a light, to shine a light on what is meant to be said and discussed. I'm deeply interested in the strong interconnection that poetry has with gender, because I also believe that nowadays it would be very silly not to recognize how poetry has changed in its experimental features, also thanks to our, I hate the terms giving voice, but finally there is a restitution of platform for voices of marginalized experiences of life, one of the many being people gender non-conforming. And this reflects in the form itself. I think it would be very silly of us not to recognize that there is a different interaction, that people that come from a situation of oppression and silencing can develop through poetry, also as part of a style. So it's not merely an attempt of making propaganda, as has been said by some critics and some politicians. It's a matter of looking deeper and further into the stylistic forms that adapt from the experience of people. I believe that feminism as we know it, both as a legacy of the 70s, both as the trans feminism that has developed from there, is facing a major challenge that is always that is somewhat embraced by any gender non-conforming person. And perhaps the most pressing challenge today is the intensification of anti-gender movements, which is a coordinated and transnational backlash that frames gender studies and queer theory and feminist politics as ideological threats. Well, this backlash deploys both, well, not just both, but like legal and cultural and media mechanisms to curtail bodily autonomy, to restrict educational curricula, which is very close to my heart as an academic, and delegitimize scholarly and activist work. And this is both a reactionary and highly organized system that is cutting across political contexts while reinforcing structural inequalities. I really hope that what we're facing now will be solved in 10 years from now, but I'm afraid not. And I believe that tomorrow's challenge may lie in negotiating the tension between fluidity and capture. As gender expressions and identities proliferate, both institutions and platforms, but also the states increasingly attempt to regulate and categorize and monetize from them. So the risk is that the emancipatory practices now become normalized and commodified and also bureaucratically fixed to a certain extent. And in this way, they might lose their transformative charge. So sustaining the radical potential of gender as a form of critique, as a form of practice, as a form of world making, now does and will require constant vigilance and collective experimentation. Only three is truly restrictive, but if really forced to choose, I guess I would say probably bell hooks for the way she managed to reshape thought through an ethics of care, intersectionality, and radical pedagogy. Probably Silvia Federici for her insistence on the political centrality of reproductive labor, the social reproduction, and the gender dynamics of capitalism. And also importantly, Judith Butler for their revolutionary understanding of gender as performative, and for the capacity of destabilizing long-held assumptions in philosophy, politics, and social movements. But really, one could, of course, name dozens of others from different genealogies, I believe. And we talked about Audre Lorde briefly. There is, of course, Teresa de Lauretis, Sara Med. And when it comes to the Italian genealogy, in our case, for example, being myself Italian, originally Carla Lonzi, of course. So it's very hard to just pick three. Perhaps only this. So I believe that feminist work is always collective, communal. Even when it appears tethered to an individual name or author, It arises from a shared struggle, from activist infrastructures and intergenerational dialogues, together with intellectual lineage that exceed any one figure. So if there is something worth adding, maybe it's the reminder that feminist history is never finished. It is an ongoing, situated practice of imagining and building more livable worlds. And this can only be achieved by not idealizing a single subject, but remembering that it's something that we have to fight for as sisters at all times.